Welcome to Resistant AI's event series, where we will arm you with the knowledge you need to fight today's increasingly sophisticated financial criminals.
Welcome everybody. Welcome to our first session in this Bright Talk series, 2022, the year of fraud as a service. And with me today, great pleasure to welcome on our panel Levi Gundert, who's SVP of Global Intelligence at Recorded Future. Levi has a long track record of working in threat intelligence for both businesses and government agencies, has a very interesting past, having served in the US Secret Service and collaborated with the FBI as well. And then my colleague Martin Rehak is CEO here at Resistant.ai, one of our key founders. Martin, prior to starting Resistant about 3 years ago, co-founded and built Cognitive Security, which subsequently became Cisco Cognitive Threat Analytics. So welcome Levi, welcome Martin.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's great to be here. Really looking forward to the conversation.
And in this first session of our Bright Talk series, with the help of the panel, we're going to examine the threat posed by the latest generation of well-armed cybercriminals. So bad actors that are focused on committing financial crimes on a scale we've not seen until now. Leveraging the kind of data analytics tools that often are used by the same businesses they're attacking, but clearly used for their own criminal ends. Cyber-enabled financial crime has become significantly more industrialized of late, which we'll examine in this session. So the age of fraud of a service, as we term it, has most definitely arrived. So welcome to the panel. To begin, I'd like to reflect a little bit on what we've seen in recent times around financially motivated cybercrime, and perhaps begin by starting to understand the magnitude of the problem. So Levi, if I may start with you as a leading expert in threat intelligence, just how bad have things become of late? You know, how worried should we be as individuals, as businesses, as society? Is it a time to relax or is it time to react?
Well, it's a complex question, of course, right? Because we've been dealing with financial fraud for a long time in terms of having a cyber nexus and a cyber component, you know, going back 20 plus years. And obviously, some of the early days of fraud was really around payment cards and really in the early days of the internet, you know, stealing payment cards in bulk and using those in massive sort of monetization opportunities. And the point is that, you know, fraudsters continue to be very clever, and where there's money to be made, of course, you know, they're looking for the weak spots and the cracks to exploit to be able to do that. And, you know, whether it's COVID-19 relief funds, whether it's tax return fraud, or other types of fraud, there's just a lot of incentives right now, right? There's a lot of incentives to find new methodologies that work, and obviously, you know, fraud continues to be a massive problem. And if you just look at, you know, the amount of resources that companies put into fighting fraud, and trying to mitigate some of their losses, it's an enormous problem. And you know, technology is great, but of course, there's always that double-edged sword of bad human behavior and malicious human behavior utilizing technology, unfortunately. And because of the complexity that comes with a lot of financial transactions today, especially in the personal world and consumer world, it really is a huge problem and a huge issue. And we obviously track it from an intelligence perspective, but it's hard to quantify, you know, just how big the problem is without, you know, sort of putting these artificial labels on it. But, you know, I'm sure Martin can give more perspective on, you know, the size and the magnitude of the problem. But I would say from our perspective, it really is an enormous challenge right now.
Okay, Levi, that's great. Yeah, I pick up on one word there, which was resources. And I think our belief, certainly here in Resistant, is that the cyber criminals, those committing financial crime in this way, have never been better resourced. Indeed, Martin, I know you firmly believe that cybercrime and financial crime are converging. You know, how's that manifesting itself? What are you seeing?
Once you learn how to steal money in the cyber domain or in the computer fraud domain, you are not going back to dealing drugs on the corner of the street, because the danger is 1,000 times bigger. I think the best example is when Apple Pay started. Apple Pay is an incredibly safe protocol. If you look at it from the academic perspective and the analysis perspective, it's super safe, it's really a very safe way how to pay, and something I would recommend to anyone who's paying in a dodgy or like not quite trustful locations. So contactless and your mobile phone are a way to go. On the other side, the fraud exploded. So you introduce something that's super safe, and suddenly you have a huge amount of fraud. And the reason was that people abused onboarding processes that were tied to the old card system. So they actually onboarded some existing legacy cards on the Apple Pay of other people or their own, and they started milking them. So they used the super secure protocol as a way how to obscure what they were doing on the card level. And they turned payment fraud into application fraud, which is actually something that's happening now. And now they repeat this with COVID grants and application process for them. We see and we have heard documents of hundreds of millions of dollars of crime at least. We can imagine it actually is much more. And once you do that, you don't go back. You start applying for loans, you get into insurance, and the fraud is getting really intermingled with the cybercrime and with the information available on the black markets. And that's something that Levi can talk about quite a bit.
And on that point, Levi, do you think that we as individuals underestimate the scale of the threat?
It probably depends who you talk to, right? You know, if you talk to federal investigators that work in the fraud space, you know, they probably say that, you know, the public is largely unaware of just how deep fraud goes, you know, and how prolific it is on a global scale. And obviously the internet facilitates a lot of the criminal community and being able to, you know, buy, sell, and trade criminal goods and services that helps facilitate a lot of this. And the ecosystem is really a fascinating piece of this because the rewards are substantial, you know, and it's well documented even in mainstream media. You know, you see these examples like, you know, Martin was talking about with Apple Pay, but there's numerous examples of COVID-19 fraud or cryptocurrency exchange thefts, you know, and to the tunes of millions of billions of dollars. It really becomes this sort of insidious problem when you think about how the tech world thinks about digital identities and then how fraudsters think about digital identities and all the different ways they can exploit them to make money. So I think, you know, my long-winded answer here, trying to come back and answer your question, is that, you know, there's probably a corner of the world, you know, that's in this space that understands the scale of the problem. But I think sometimes it's too late for consumers, right? When they realize that they're sustaining some sort of loss, but the process may have started, you know, months prior. And again, it just comes back to clever actors that, you know, figure out that there's a methodology somewhere that can be exploited, and, you know, those identities just become sort of a piece in the chain somewhere.
You know, that's a good point. The piece in the chain, the ecosystem. I think that's perhaps that not sort of the person in the street, the regular consumer, doesn't appreciate how complex this is and how well resourced it is and how innovative the bad actors are. I mean, Martin used the example of Apple Pay, you know, quite a well documented example of something very secure but being used in a very successful way in terms of fraud. Martin, I mean, to move on to sort of understand how all of this works and then move towards looking at potential solutions.
So definitely interesting question, because Levi is pretty much on the supply side of the cybercrime and bad information. And to be more specific, he's against the supply side. He's fighting them. Mm-hmm. What we look at is the buy side, the people who buy and exploit identities and use them in fraud. And these are our enemies, people we counter, people we try to oppose every single day. And they are incredibly creative and resourceful. So to some extent, we are seeing the same thing we have seen in basically early 2000s, when people were figuring out how to make money with cybercrime. Because if you hacked a computer in 1990s, it was pretty boring. Typically, unless you were very lucky with a banking computer, well, it wasn't much money to be stolen. In 2000, when internet started, people started using computers to do business, and suddenly email carried money. You could connect to bank and steal money, which was pretty much unencrypted, and the stakes increased. Until recently, identity was something that you couldn't monetize quite well. But right now, with digital services and digital onboarding, digital insurance, and everything moving to the digital space, identities are becoming very rich and they are becoming very well monetizable. And we see this in the supply side, people stealing them more diligently. We see this on the application side when people use them and they onboard any stolen identity into up to 10, 15, 20 services, because why wouldn't you?
We saw PayPal had identified millions and millions of accounts which they had determined were created for fraudulent purposes. But we've also have, don't we, the creation of identities from scratch, or the blending of real and made up information, so synthetic identities. Just how much of a challenge is that?
Yeah, no, it's a great point. So, I remember when I was in federal law enforcement, after I got out, there was some really interesting work that banks were doing, financial services institutions were doing, just sort of understanding how many compromised accounts existed within their ecosystem. To your point, it's very hard to take one reported loss or one victim and try to pursue try to turn that lead into a criminal investigation is very difficult because the volume is just overwhelming. And so it's really financial services institutions working with law enforcement to try and put together much larger cases where the fraud losses are pretty substantial to meet the thresholds that exist in various cities for prosecution and so forth. And it takes a lot of work. To Martin's point, there's so much of this that slips through the cracks for a lot of different reasons. And, that's unfortunate because I think there's a ton of reasons in terms of causation and why this is still possible that Martin can speak to much more cogently than I can in terms of the technology itself. But the bottom line for fraudsters is that there's a lot of money to be made, and the risk to reward ratio is still pretty favorable for them. In law enforcement, we always say, a lot of times it's the stupid ones that get caught, right? But the smart ones can do it for a long time and never get caught. So there's a lot of work to do here, and really, the situation hasn't changed a whole lot in terms of, comparing the amount of fraud globally to just the number of investigators that are in this space and the resources that are available at any given time to pursue it is just a drop in the bucket.
But it seems to me that the sheer scale of what we're facing is kind of derived from how easy it is now to do this with certain tools and techniques, which I'm sure you can tell us a little bit more about.
It is very easy. So what Levi described is something we see on a daily basis. We call these identities robotic identities because they are either robots, basically based on identities of actual real people, or they are synthetic, which means that the level of security on the onboarding is so low that you can onboard someone who doesn't even exist, which may not be necessarily the fault of the company, but in some countries, you simply legally cannot have access to the data about population. So you must trust documents submitted by people who onboard themselves. So given those limitations, and given the fact that you are dealing with 200 legal systems globally, give or take, it's incredibly difficult to have a reasonable onboarding process for a worldwide service. And that's where lots of the risk is. And that's where the automation comes in. Because essentially the kind of crime we are fighting is completely different from what we learned, what we have seen in the past. It's a little bit like a dystopian future where software is fighting software. So you have AI onboarding systems on one side, and you have robotic identities powered by scripted behaviors or AI on the other side, so that they slip through the different steps in the onboarding process, get onboarded, and suddenly they get sold on the black market to someone else. So if I need to launder $200,000 from a small ransomware attack I did yesterday night, I need to get 20 robotic identities or so that I can pretend I run a website and I made this much money on the advertisement, or I got the money from Amazon affiliate payments or any other legitimate source of income. And I have pretty good chances going to pass unnoticed, because no one is actually looking at the collusion of non-existent people to achieve money laundering, to steal the money from fraud. And even more interestingly, what happens is that these uses reinforce each other. So you steal identity of one person, you onboard it on a platform, you do a bunch of money laundering for something that looks like a legitimate business. And suddenly that business is eligible for a loan. And the loan gets offered to you by a different AI algorithm. And they say, well, do you want to get $500,000? And they said, well, hell yes. And you got another bonus for having a stolen identity. So this kind of combination is great. And then you can go into insurance company and you insure the company you have. For car theft, you get 10 cars for the company, they suddenly get stolen and you get paid back. So there is incredible amount of layering of crimes you can put on top of each other, and you can monetize stolen identities. And then it's very hard to investigate because there is no one to go to.
No, it's true. I mean, what you've highlighted there is the lengths that the criminals will go to invest in their business, and it is a business. In fact, I think someone said that some of the larger crime organizations would be in the FTSE 100 or equivalent indices, just based on their turnover. So they're clearly investing a lot of time to then, as Levi said, do the cash out to benefit from the fruits of their efforts. I mean, Levi, just to turn back to yourself, and in general terms, when you're advising your business customers on actions to take, are you ever talking about a single solution, or are you talking about a layered approach to combating this threat? I mean, just to give us some feel for what the kind of consulting you would be doing to organizations to defend themselves.
Yeah, it really is a layered approach. And, I think these days, the term that's very popular is resilience, right? Everybody wants to be resilient, and ultimately they want to, reduce risk for the organization. And, I know from personal experience, for some financial services institutions, they're expecting a certain amount of fraud and they're going to write it off at the end of the year. And they want to keep the number, below whatever that threshold is. And it's really important. But for other companies, they're not necessarily prepared for certain fraud losses and how it's going to impact their business. So there really is a layered approach. And, in certain heavily regulated industries, obviously there's the compliance angle, and that's really important from an anti-money laundering perspective, the know your customer requirements. But there's a lot of companies entering the fintech ecosystem, especially now. But now, criminals, everything that happens in the criminal ecosystem is really around cryptocurrency. And because there's plenty of exchanges where you can still transact business between cryptocurrency and fiat currencies in a semi-anonymous manner, this is by far the preferred route for money movement. And a lot of these exchanges exist in places like Russia, where there really isn't a lot of regulatory oversight, and they're not really concerned with complying with Western U.S. Treasury regulations on AML and know your customer. So it really facilitates a lot of this type of illicit money movement. If there's a crackdown or there's sanctions in these types of exchanges, it will definitely alter the landscape in terms of how criminals prefer to move money. But they have to be able to convert it to fiat currency at some point, right, to make it usable. And so there's a lot of companies that are involved in the ecosystems now, and there's a lot of options, right, for bad actors. So I think, again, not to be super long-winded with this, but to your original question, when companies that are either directly involved in the ecosystem or tangentially involved in the ecosystem, their primary concern usually is regulatory compliance and making sure that they're doing what they need to do. And as regulatory compliance catches up in some of these spaces, there will be tightening that happens, in a lot of the exchanges. And what that means is that criminals are going to continue to hunt for new and innovative methods of money movement. And to Martin's point, identities, whether they're synthetic identities, or even more important, are existing identities that can be taken over, really become crucially important in the ecosystem. And there's a new premium placed on the value of existing identities. So while the original point of compromise and identity may be the email address that gets taken over, of course, that's just the beginning of a long thread, right, that gets pulled on in terms of really holistically consuming someone's identity and wholesale taking it over to facilitate things, because anonymous transactions become much, much harder to accomplish. And so I think we're in a very interesting time. We're sort of in this inflection point where, again, the regulatory regimes are going to catch up to what's happening in the cryptocurrency space and the fintech space, and there's going to be less opportunities. But again, that's just going to be another opportunity for bad actors and criminals to innovate again. And it really is going to revolve around identity, even more so than it probably is today.
I mean, and that inflection point, I think we're facing those continuously, but it seems that there's a really big one now. We clearly need some very effective countermeasures. I like the term resilience. I think Martin would perhaps adjust that to resistance or resistant, but you know, levity aside, we hear an awful lot about anti-fraud platforms, compliance services. Everyone has some kind of machine learning, AI angle. I mean, Martin, this has been your life for quite a long time. What are the differentiating factors here? What does good look like? And you know, if we can put it this way, is all AI created equal? How do we kind of counter this threat with technology?
I think people shouldn't say like, I'm using AI. That's my favorite complaint about anything. Because when you say I use AI, it's kind of, it doesn't say, it's I use mathematics. So you should always use AI to achieve something, some specific goal. And the way how we look at it is that identities are getting much richer. Levi mentioned that new generation of malware is stealing all facets of behavior. So it actually does capture your keystrokes, because these are used as a second factor in PSD2 regulated customer authentication. So this actually can get around your requirement to in the online payments. And it's not the only aspect. It's looking at the documents. It's trying to collect documents in your mailbox and everything else that can be used to enrich the identity. So digital identities we have now are arguably getting as rich as your physical self to some extent. And it's definitely easy to monetize. And what needs to come on the other side is intelligence used to verify those complex identities. Right now, the onboarding process in many institutions is basically you take a selfie, you take a picture of the ID card or driver's license, and you are done. That is not sufficient. In 2021, 2022, we have seen, and we are seeing that this is definitely not enough, and that you need to use those rich digital identities that are already used by the attackers to defend yourself. And you need to validate all of the aspects of that identity. And I would say that machine learning is the only way how to do this. Different aspects of connections, of business, how does it all fit together? How does the behavior fit with the personality? Could this transaction have happened? And why would this kind of person be doing this kind of transaction? Is the question that humans ask when they investigate something, but we need to be asking that at every single transaction. And that's the future I imagine. On the other side, we need to be conscious of privacy, because we have never in the history lost so much privacy as individuals in our physical world. You basically cannot walk anywhere without being photographed, filmed, or like being exposed to some extent. And in the same time, criminals are causing so much damage because they abuse identities they can steal without any damage to them, any risk. So there is a very nice dichotomy. Something needs to change. I believe that something is more automation and more intelligence looking at criminals and fighting them.
Interesting. And do you feel, Martin, that perhaps we've been driven to focus really on identifying who the person is, who's behind the browser, who's dealing with us in a digital onboarding context, but really now we've moved past that we need to be looking at whether those hundreds and thousands of entities actually coming from the same source. Do we think we're looking at kind of beyond the single check that whether Martin is presenting his passport and it looks like Martin when he puts himself in front of the camera, that actually what we're seeing is a much larger scale attack. You referenced a specific case in Europe recently.
Maybe I do not exist. Maybe I'm just a video. But what I see is really like the age of single check is over. You may be still doing that because of compliance requirements, but you definitely shouldn't be doing that if you protect your own money or your customers' good reputation or your good reputation. It's too dangerous. You need to have a defense in depth. something that came to security 10 years ago, and it needs to extend into anti-fraud and anti-financial crime. Otherwise, we will be still fighting ransomware 50 years from now because no one will be able to stop the proceeds from being used. So the ability to stop the financial crime is instrumental in basically protecting humans from all other kinds of crime.
Yeah, often the fraud is the least worst part of the whole ecosystem that we talked about. I mean, Levi, as we close off, any further thoughts from yourself?
Yeah, I love the whole concept behind, what Martin just said, and really what him and the team are doing here, and that the scale of the challenge is enormous, and it's not something that can be fought and won, purely with humans. And obviously, Martin and his team, think deeply about what criminal activity looks like and what suspicious activity looks like, and there's all kinds of rules that can be developed out of that. But also, machines fighting machines on this is really what's happening in the background, right? So you have a human, they want to make a financial transaction. How does that look different from a criminal when they want to make a financial transaction, or they have a bot doing it on their behalf? We see, for example, credential stuffing attacks happen all the time, where a threat actor gains access to a database or has a large volume of credentials in the millions, right? And they need to determine in that database how many are currently legitimate and can authenticate right now, right? And so they take that database and they use a massive infrastructure of proxies around the world, so that they're using different IP addresses, they're using different browser fingerprints for every one of those. Every time they try to authenticate using a credential pair in the database, and they do that so that they have a subset that is ready to be used right now. And you think about the technology that they're using in that type of credential stuffing attack. It's 100% automated, right? There's no human manual component in that attack. It's 100% automated. And I think Martin makes it just a fabulous point here, in that in winning this in the long term, it's very much going to continue to be a cat and mouse game. But if we're not making the best use of technology on the other end, then we're sort of already lost right before we started. And I think the efforts that Martin and his team are making here are huge, in that if bad guys are going to automate, and bad guys, and we see this too around things like business email compromise now, where threat actors are using deepfake technology to impersonate CEOs and CFOs, both video and voice. And there have been a number of large attacks where there was massive amount of money that was moved from a legitimate company's bank account, because somebody thought in accounts payable thought they were talking to the actual CEO of a company, because it was the CEO's voice. And you sort of think about how criminals are leveraging artificial intelligence in those types of attacks, and just using automation in general when it comes to fraud. There's no way that we can possibly make a dent in the problem without being just as good or better in the technology.
No, I completely agree, Lou. I think it certainly is an arms race, as you pointed out earlier. And to come back to the question right at the top, should we relax or should we react? I think we have to never underestimate the scale of the problem and never stop innovating.
Perfect. Let me just return to compliment Levi, because what he's doing with Recorded Future on the supply side of the information is equally important, if not more important, than what we do. Because if we let that information from anyone to be on the black market forever, there is nothing left to protect at some point. So I think that job is incredibly important, and it goes beyond just helping the customers. It's helping people beyond your customer base.
Excellent. Well, thank you both so much for attending today. Thanks for those who've been listening. And just to mention that while this was the first in our series, the next one is coming out soon as well, where we'll be looking into a little bit more detail into specific ways to counter the threat that we've been talking about, or as we've titled it, how not to get burned when choosing AI for financial crime protection. So look forward to moderating that session in the near future. Thanks everyone for their time. Thanks for listening, and we'll speak soon. Thank you.
Thank you for attending. Please visit our Bright Talk channel, where you'll find details about our other events. Please be sure to rate this session.